So I'm teaching, I'll briefly review how we approach the holiday. Remember, we approach the holiday at 4 levels. This is every Jewish holiday, by the way. We look at the historical background, if there is any. So, for example, Rosh Hashanah does not have much historical background. Passover and Hanukkah obviously do. Purim does. Some of the historical background for some holidays is only in the Midrash. For example, Yom Kippur. So in any case, we look at any historical text that we have to understand how the Bible or later literature understood the history of the holiday. The second level of studying the holidays is looking at the ritual. And we want to understand how to do the ritual, what the ritual means, how the ritual came into being. The third level is the symbolic, metaphoric level, which means we took a look at the historical, the ritual, and we ask at a deeper level, what do these things stand for? What values do they refer to? And then we look at the transformative level, which is the one that's oftentimes not addressed, is how do you take all of this and internalize it for your growth, transformation as a human being. So just a very little on these. I'm going to do more of the historical tonight. The ritual side is not that hard to understand. It's easy to look up and find out how we do it. The symbolic side, remember, in the Hasidic tradition, focuses on the idea of the candle. And with the idea of the candle, we have what is called the organuz, or the essence to which the oil refers. And you might say that's the authentic self, the essence of the human being down inside the soul. And what happens to all of us some of the time, and some of us most of the time, unfortunately, is we lose connection with that essence. We start to feel lack of meaning, lack of purpose. Other negative affects and emotions can fill our consciousness: despair, anxiety, fear, etc. Sometimes people have guilt, sometimes people have shame. So our inner life becomes clouded with what you might call, I don't mean this very strongly, but in Hanukkah you would call it impurity. Now, these emotions are necessary parts of us as human beings. These emotions, feelings, and thoughts, they're necessary parts of us. They're adaptive in some way, and they're only not adaptive until they cause us suffering or other people suffering. So the metaphor for Hanukkah is there's an authentic aspect of the spirit and soul down within us, and it is not expressed into our life. So the idea of Hanukkah is, the question is, how do we light that oil? So we have to have the wick, and the wick is the practice, and then we have to light the candle, as it were, with our consciousness and intentionality. So the wick is the mitzvah, or the practice. The light comes from our consciousness, and so therefore the Hasidic tradition refers to the verse from Psalms, Ner mitzvah v'torah or. The candle is the mitzvah, or the practice, and the light is the Torah, is the teaching, all of it connected to the organuz. So when you light your Hanukkah candles, you can look at the history. I'll talk about that tonight a little bit. You can focus on the beautiful ritual. It is quite beautiful, quite aesthetic. On the symbolic dimension, the light, the wick, and the soul. And the transformative would be actually to meditate on this. And this is where we have to bring a great deal of kavanah, of intentionality, and decide to make the holiday meaningful and transformative. And that takes great will and even some skill. So I think the first 3 parts are wonderful. I love the history. I love the ritual. I love the symbols. But there's a moment when you have to deeply internalize them. So tonight I want to take a look at the first book of Maccabees. It's there's nowhere in our calendar that we actually study the book of Maccabees. You have to get a Bible with an apocrypha in it, such as this one. Look the book up online. And I want to read a few passages from it. Now, there's wonderful scholarship on each of the book of Maccabees. I have 2 commentaries from the Anchor Bible, and they're probably close to 600 pages each on each of the books of the Maccabees. There's incredible history behind it. Scholars are asking who wrote it, for what audience, for what purpose, etc. So I'll read a little bit of from First Maccabees, and you'll begin to see some of these questions answered. So it's important just to remember, by the way, it does not seem that First Maccabees and Second Maccabees knew of each other. It's not as if one is derived from the other. They seem to be two different histories written roughly at the same time by two different people with two different interests. So in First Maccabees, it goes back to Alexander. So this is we know that they were aware that there was Alexander who defeated the Persians. It says he slaughtered kings, traversed the earth to remotest bounds, and plundered innumerable nations. This author does not like Alexander the Great. When at last the world lay quiet under his rule, his pride knew no limits. He built up an extremely powerful army, ruled over countries and nations and dominions, and all paid him tribute. Then when he died, he divided up his kingdom among his generals. It cuts straight to a descendant of his stock was that wicked man Antiochus Epiphanes, the son of King Antiochus. So now we have the setup. Alexander the Great. Oh, I'm sorry, folks. I'll get my page back. Let's see, back to the Maccabees. Straight from Alexander the Great to Antiochus Epiphanes, and then straight to the civil war from this author's perspective that broke out between the Hellenistic Jews and what we'll call the Pietists, the traditional Jews. It says, at that time there appeared in Israel a group of renegade Jews who incited the people. Let us enter into a covenant with the Gentiles round about, because disaster upon disaster has overtaken us since we segregated ourselves from them. So from their perspective, any suffering that they had was due to the Judeans attached to the religion of their ancestors, that there had been some kind of hostility or enmity between the Judeans and the Syrian Hellenists. Now, there had been some very, very unfortunate events. This is in the more detailed history. But the solution of the so-called renegade Jews was to make a covenant with the Syrian Hellenists. The people thought this was a good argument, meaning some people. And some of them, in their enthusiasm, went to the king and received authority to introduce non-Jewish laws and customs. So now here we have the evidence that there was a small group of Judeans who wanted to Hellenize, went to King Antiochus IV, and asked him to bring Hellenization to Judea. In fact, what they wanted was to make Jerusalem into an official polis, an official city in the Syrian Hellenistic Empire. It goes on and says, they removed their mark of circumcision. This is very deep. So we have evidence that the Judeans, some Judeans, the so-called, the ones who wanted to adopt Hellenism, they were very ashamed of the mark of circumcision. It set them off from all the others, especially in the competitive sports games where apparently men competed in the nude. And therefore they had to reverse circumcision. I've read a little bit about this. It's a very, very painful process to, as it were, artificially draw the skin of the penis back over to the top, so it looks like the person is uncircumcised. But some people went through this to reverse the appearance of circumcision. They repudiated the Holy Covenant. They intermarried with the Syrian Hellenists and abandoned themselves, to this author says, to evil ways. Then it says that Antiochus decided to take over one of the other of the three kingdoms that Alexander had left, the Alexandrian in North Africa. He marched down to Alexandria to conquer Alexandria. He ran out of money to pay his troops. He arrives in Jerusalem and he plundered the temple. It says here, This is still in chapter 1. In his arrogance, he entered the temple and carried off the golden altar, the lampstand, all its equipment, table for the bread and the presents, the sacred cups and bowls, the golden censers, the curtains, the crowns. He stripped off all the gold plating from the temple front. He seized the silver, gold, and precious vessels, and whatever secret treasures he found, he took them all with him when he left for his own country. He caused much bloodshed, and he gloated over all he had done. Now, when we read from other sources, it seems that there was not only, according to this author, renegade Jews, there were renegade priests who wanted to be priests in this new Syrian Hellenistic temple, and they gave him access to the temple and to the secret treasury. It says 2 years later, the king sent to Judea a high revenue official who arrived at Jerusalem with a powerful force. He dealt a heavy blow, killed many Israelites, plundering the city, and sent it ablaze. Then it says the city of David was turned into a citadel, enclosed by a high, stout wall, garrisoned by impious foreigners and renegades. Now this is crucial. These are the Syrian Hellenists who apparently this movement was restricted to the cities. And in the rural areas, people were not part of this. Otherwise, why would the Syrian Hellenists have to build themselves a stout wall in Jerusalem? So it seemed to be those who wanted Jerusalem to become a Greek polis were separated from the rural Judeans. The story goes on. Now we're going to fast forward to the Maccabees in the town of Modi'in. And it says here, I'm cutting forward. By the way, there are many dramatic speeches in First Maccabees. So at a certain point, Mattathias says, though all the nations within the king's dominion obey him and forsake their ancestral worship, though they have chosen to submit to his commands, yet I and my sons and brothers will follow the covenant of our fathers. Heaven forbid that we should ever abandon the law and its statutes. We will not obey the command of the king, nor will we deviate one step from our forms of worship. When he made this speech in the town of Modi'in, a Jew stepped forward and offered a sacrifice to the idolatrous god. So Mattathias comes up and he kills that man. And then they had to flee. He and his sons took to the hills, leaving all their belongings behind them. I am now in 1 Maccabees chapter 2. At that time, many who wanted to maintain the religion and law went down to the wilds to live there. They took their sons, wives, cattle. Their miseries were more than they could bear. Word got back to Antiochus, so he sent his army into the wilds, we assume this is the Judean desert, to hunt these people down and to kill them. It goes on and it says, there is a certain point where this gives us a great insight into the nature of Judaism at that time. There was a group of people who were utterly devoted to keeping the Sabbath. It says a large body of men went after them, meaning Hasmonean Hellenist soldiers. They prepared to attack them on the Sabbath day. And they said, come out, surrender, we have you surrounded. We will not come out. We will not obey the king's command or profane the Sabbath. Without more ado, the attack was launched. The Israelites did not fight in response, this group here, because to wield weapons on the Sabbath day was a great desecration. They said, let us all meet death with a clear conscience. We call heaven and earth to testify. There is no justice in this slaughter. So they were attacked and massacred on the Sabbath. Men, women, and children, up to 1,000 in all. So what do we see here from this author's perspective? Blind devotion to the ways of the ancestors would ultimately get them all massacred. So Mattathias says the following. They said to one another, if we all do as our brothers did, if we refuse to fight the Syrian Hellenists for our lives, as well as for our laws and customs, they will soon wipe us off the face of the earth. On that they decided that if anyone came to fight against them on the Sabbath, they would fight back, rather than all die as their brothers in the caves had done. So what do we see here? This is the beginning, many people believe, of Pharisaic Judaism. Now, the Pharisees were a group. Of course, they don't get very good press in the New Testament. In our tradition, they were the antecedents of the ancient rabbis, and they believed that the law had to be brought up to date. How they bring the law, the Torah, up to date? First, by edicts, by interpretation, and by understanding that the law is supposed to serve the people as much as the people serve the law. So this idea that Mattathias could say, we have to keep the Sabbath except when life is in danger. The Talmud says, pikuach nefesh. So many scholars see here, during the Maccabean revolt, the official beginning of Pharisaic Judaism, meaning the Torah could be interpreted to bring it up to the current times. This led to the Pharisees, and the Pharisees to the ancient rabbis. Now, it's also true, and you see this in 2 Maccabees, that when the war was over and the Hasmoneans ruled Judea, they themselves went the way of Syrian Hellenists. They wanted to be part of the Syrian Hellenistic culture. And the Pharisees actually then abandoned the Hasmoneans. The Hebrew word Pharisees from the word Pirushim, which can mean the separatist. So at one time, the Hasmoneans initiated the interpretation of Judaism to make it match the times. When the Hasmoneans themselves became too assimilated, this group of interpreters parshu, or they separated themselves, hence the word Pirushim, hence the word Pharisee. So most scholars believe, the word Pharisee means separatist, Pirushim, separated from whom? Separated from the Hasmoneans, when the Hasmoneans became too assimilated into Syrian Hellenist culture, until the Romans came in, conquered the Syrian Hellenists, and they were now, Judea became part of the Roman Empire. Just a little bit more. So now it says, Mattathias and his friends swept through the country, pulling down pagan altars. Now, listen to this. Forcibly circumcising all the circumcised boys found within the frontiers of Israel. They hunted down the arrogant enemies, and the cause prospered in their hands. Thus they saved the law from the Syrian Hellenists and their kings, and broke the power of the tyrant. So I remember when I was a kid, we were taught that Judah Maccabee was an ancient Judean Thomas Jefferson. He fought for freedom. He really didn't fight for freedom. He fought for freedom of the Judeans against the tyranny of the Syrian Hellenists. But when their territory expanded, people were not free to practice a pagan religion. They brought them back to the observance of the ancestors, including circumcising boys that had not been circumcised. And it even says here they would reverse the reversed circumcisions. It shares now many of the battles where they would destroy a force sent down by Antiochus IV, and then the word would get back that a force had been destroyed, and Antiochus would send down another force. So they never defeated the Syrian Hellenists as much as they defeated the forces that were sent down into Judea. Mattathias dies. Judah becomes the head of the group. I'll just give you an example of one of the battles. So they are facing a mighty foe with swords and shields. And then it says here, Judah advanced to meet one of his allies, and they said to him, "How can so few of us fight against so many? Besides, we have nothing to eat. We're exhausted." Judah replies, again, in the voice of first Maccabees, replies in the voice of Judah Maccabee. Many can easily overpower the few. Many can easily be overpowered by a few. It makes no difference to heaven to save by many or by few. Victory does not depend on numbers. Strength comes from heaven. Our enemies come filled with insolence and lawlessness to plunder us and to kill us and our wives and children. But we are fighting for our lives and our religion. Heaven will crush them before your eyes. You need not be afraid of them." And then the battle breaks out, and the Judeans win. Now, the Antiochus sends stronger and stronger armies down to defeat the Maccabees. And then it says here, "Judas and his brothers saw that their plight had become grave, with the enemy encamped in their frontiers. They learned that the commands which the king had given was for the complete destruction of their nation. They said to one another, 'Let us restore the shattered fortunes of our nation. Let us fight for our nation and for this holy place.' They gathered in full assembly to prepare for battle and to pray and to seek divine mercy and compassion." Just a little bit more. They're fighting now Georgius, taking a detachment of 5,000 men and 1,000 cavalry. He set out upon the people. Judah heard of this. He took his soldiers and moved out of the way. They reached the camp. They didn't find anybody, so they camped. And at daybreak, Judah attacked with 3,000 men. So we infer from this and other sources a kind of a guerrilla warfare, which means when they attack, disappear. When they camp, that's when you attack them. Another battle takes place where there's now 60,000 of the Hellenist forces. In the following year, he gathered 60,000 picked infantry and 5,000 cavalry, where Judas met them with 1,000 men. Again, he prayed, and they joined battle. Lysias lost 5,000 men in the fight, and that's when the Maccabees now realize that Antiochus has withdrawn all of his soldiers from Jerusalem. They go in and fight the renegade Jews in Jerusalem, and then, as I mentioned last night, they rededicate the temple. So now I just want to share with you a personal anecdote and see if there's any questions or comments. Many years ago, back in the early 90s, I was on the rabbi debate circuit. So everything that came up, they wanted a Reform rabbi, a conservative rabbi, and an Orthodox rabbi. So I was the official Reform rabbi. There were many of my colleagues who were the conservative rabbi in the debates that I was on. And there was a small number of Orthodox rabbis who would agree to debate a conservative rabbi and a Reform rabbi. So here's what happened. The book that I had read on this historical period was by a man named Victor Cherikover, 1894 to 1958, if I'm not mistaken. Born in Russia, moved to Eretz Yisrael, went to the Hebrew University, and taught classics, including the history of this period. So Cherikover's book is called Hellenistic Civilization and the Jews. And when I was a student at the Hebrew University, I had to read this book. I took a class in Second Temple history. And here was Cherikover's interpretation. He said that the city dwellers in Jerusalem were the bourgeois. Now, the word bourgeois actually means city dweller, town dweller. And they were the high priests, the other priests, higher level craftsmen, those who worked at the temple, and they had a class interest in joining the Syrian Hellenists. So from Cherikover's perspective, they didn't really believe in the Hellenistic gods. They really didn't want to adopt Hellenistic religion. From their perspective, Judea would always be a poor backwater unless they joined the Syrian Hellenistic Empire. Hence their desire to make Jerusalem into a polis. How do we know that they wanted to make Jerusalem into a polis? They built a stadium, a sports arena, which was a signal institution for participating in Hellenism. So Cherikover says that the upper class was concentrated in Jerusalem, and they wanted all of this purely out of class interest. The rural people, who he says were oppressed by the town dwellers in Jerusalem, did not see any great benefit in joining the Syrian Hellenists, and they were attached to the religion of their ancestors. So Cherrycover says that what was behind all of this was class warfare. Clearly, Cherrycover was a Marxist. When I read the book, I really hadn't thought that he's writing from a Marxist perspective. I just accepted his history. And so whenever I taught this period to advanced people, I used Cherrycover. So here I am at this debate, and I present Cherrycover. The Orthodox rabbi got up and said, no, this is about the Orthodox versus the Reformed Jews. The renegades were the Reformed Jews, like you, and the traditionalists were the Orthodox Jews. And this was really a religious war, not a class war, but a religious war. So I said to him, well, who are you studying? And he said, Elias Bickerman. Have you read Elias Bickerman? I said, no, I read Victor Cherrycover. He says, who's Cherrycover? Here's what it turns out. There were a few great scholars of the period. One was Victor Cherrycover. One was Elias Bickerman. And each was a professor of classics. Each knew the languages. And each one had a completely different interpretation of these two books. That was a fascinating debate on what the miracle meant and what was behind the war. But what I wanted to share with you is I hope that you will go out and look at First Maccabees, maybe read it with a good commentary. It's a fascinating book, and you'll detect the point of view of the author as he's going through the book. Tomorrow night, I want to talk about Second Maccabees, which has a very different perspective, and some utterly fascinating ideas, something that a few of you have heard before, but most of you haven't, and that is how there came to be oil in the Middle East. If you ever wondered how there came to be oil in the Middle East, we have the answer in Second Maccabees, which I'll talk about tomorrow night.